What does it mean to be human? It's a question that's been asked by countless artists, writers, philosophers, and college kids who've been hitting the bong too hard. One of those writers, Richard Matheson, asked the question in 1954. That's right, that's how old this story is, when he wrote I Am Legend. And if you've only seen the movie, you might be asking how this story could be about anything that deep. This is just a generic post-apocalyptic plague outbreak story. And here's what Richard Matheson has to say about that.
I keep waiting for them to do my book, I Am Legend. They've done it 3 times and they haven't done it yet.
To learn about the vampires in the original story, an alcoholic who believes he's the last man on Earth, and a dog with a lot less page time than screen time, stick around for the rest of the video. When we first meet Robert Neville, we see him checking on his greenhouse in the backyard and the water tank that he's built to provide himself with a consistent supply of fresh water. He's a tall man in his early 30s with bright blue eyes and a cigarette dangling from his lips. Also, we're in Southern California. He starts to harvest the garlic from his greenhouse and separates the cloves and punches holes in them, hanging them from wire and making garlic necklaces out of it. When he's finished, he goes outside to nail the garlic necklaces to the boards over his windows, and then he goes into his workroom and starts to make steaks, which he can never seem to get enough of. Pretty soon, it's 4:45, just about an hour before nighttime, which is when they usually show up. Sure enough, by 6:30, Ben Cortman is outside screaming, "Come out, Neville!" But from past nights, Neville knows that there's not just one of them out there, there are many. And we very quickly get to our first thing that was really left out of the movie, but maybe the most understandable thing that was left out of the movie. He never looked at them anymore. In the beginning, he'd made a peephole in the front window and watched them. But then the women had seen him and started striking vile postures in order to entice him out of the house. But Neville is just a man in his 30s who is alone, and so he does find himself thinking about these women in a sexual way. Even though he doesn't really view these creatures as human anymore, he lacks any intimacy or human connection, and this struggle to keep his sexual desires in check is something that he is going to struggle with throughout the entire story. Thankfully, we don't venture anywhere extremely problematic, although there will be a fair share of criticism from my part about some of Neville's thoughts and actions, but that is kind of a miracle that it only gets that bad considering this was written in the 1950s. I just mostly want to point out this part of Neville's personality since I think it is a major distinction between who he is in the book and who he is in the movie. Obviously, this was cut from the movie because they probably wanted it to be PG-13, and while they never describe the things that the women are actually doing, Neville does describe them as pretty vile. Next, we see how Robert deals with most of his problems, especially towards the beginning of the story, including his sex drive, which is alcohol. Oh man, does he drink a lot. Honestly though, if there was ever anyone who it is understandable has a drinking problem, it's probably the guy who lives in an apocalyptic situation and thinks he's probably the last person on Earth. Not that I'm condoning it or saying that it's a smart choice, but you do have to understand this guy's really going through it. So he gets hammered and then frustrated and finally goes to bed. As you can tell, the original Robert Neville is not quite the upstanding citizen that Will Smith's version of the character is in the movie. I wouldn't say the book version of him is like a villain or anything, but he's not sticking around out of some misguided feeling of responsibility to the people in the city either.
If you leave tomorrow at dawn, we can make it to Vermont in a straight shot. So if you
I'm not leaving. This is ground zero. This is my site. I'm not gonna let this happen. I can still fix this.
Instead of a decorated army colonel who is also a doctor, he was just kind of your average blue-collar worker before the plague hit. After the plague, he's really just a broken man. He's lost his family. He has, like I mentioned, no human companionship or human connection, and is slowly losing his mental stability over the course of the story. Instead of a hero, I tended to think of him as someone who I just felt bad for and whose thoughts and actions I often found reprehensible. There are some similarities, though. Both characters have lost their families, although in different ways. In the movie, Neville loses his family in a helicopter crash, which there's nothing like inherently wrong with that as a story decision, but doesn't really feel very thematically relevant to the rest of the story. In the novel, he loses his family the way you would expect during a plague outbreak, which is to the plague. Kathy, his daughter, was the first one to pass away, and he disposed of her body according to the law at the time, which was by putting it into the massive burn pit. That's why when his wife Virginia died, he was unable to bring himself to put her body in the burn pit and buried her illegally. He pays the price for this decision later when she comes back to life and attacks him, forcing him to kill her himself. So yeah, Robert Neville, not the best guy in the original story, but he also has not had an easy time of things. And by the time the story even starts, he has been alone with no human contact for about 6 months. As you may have gathered from the intro or the thumbnail, the monsters in the original story are not just like these weird generic zombie things, they're straight up old school vampires. The generic monster things that were in the movie are also pretty lazy. They don't even really take the time to establish or define like what they even are. I'm really only saying zombie based on their appearance because I think that that's as close as we can get to like an easy comparison. The switch away from vampires is a very odd decision because, as we'll see, these are very explicitly vampires in the original source material. This isn't some like vampires with a different name like we see with zombies all the time. Neville explicitly talks about them being vampires, and a core part of the plot is actually him researching and doing experiments to explain the myths that surround vampires in a way that is more scientific, like why they're scared of crosses, why staking them works, all that kind of stuff. But on this particular day, he ends up kind of theorizing or figuring out that sunlight kills them, and so captures one of the vampires and takes them home to make sure that they don't come back to life at nighttime after they've been exposed to the sun. Which it really feels like he should have figured out more quickly, since A, they stay inside all day long and only come out at night, and B, we've already established in the story that vampire stories exist in this world because we literally see him reading Bram Stoker's Dracula in one of the scenes. But what he doesn't realize during this whole escapade is that he had forgot to wind his watch the night before. Again, this book takes place in the 1970s, but it was written in the 50s, so I guess he just didn't really see the automatic winding watch coming. Either way, he thinks he has a lot more time than he does, but as soon as he realizes that his watch isn't ticking anymore, he starts to rush home because he's a lot closer to sunset than he thought he was. A melee ensues with some of the vampires that are outside waiting for him, but he makes it back inside, scared but thankfully unharmed. We actually do get a similar scene in the movie where he gets trapped by the monsters. The movie calls them Dark Seekers, which I think is a horrible name. Anyways, after he gets trapped, he wakes up and it's dark now and they chase him and his dog dies defending him. Don't worry, we'll get to the dog. He has his own section of the video. After his encounter where he stays out a little bit too late, we flash forward 3 months in the story and Robert has cleaned up his life quite a bit. He's no longer drinking nearly as much and he has also soundproofed the house, so he's not tortured by the sound of the vampires taunting him at night anymore. Also, through a little bit of a flashback, we learned before the apocalypse there were frequent dust storms that were caused by insects, and also there were some bombings that seemed to be notable enough that they just call them the bombings. Before you ask, we can kind of make inferences, but we're never explicitly told how these bugs caused dust storms or what these bombings were in reference to. This specific thing with the bombings and bugs and dust storms kind of goes into the category of okay to cut from the adaptation. In my mind, since it's pretty loosely explained in the original source material in the book and really only tangentially relevant to the plot anyways. Now, having sobered up and soundproofed the house, he's moved on to trying to understand the virus better. Why does garlic keep them away from the house? Why are they scared of crosses? So he performs several experiments, including injecting the chemical that gives garlic its characteristic smell into one of the vampires, but nothing happens. On to the next step, he hangs a cross in front of one of the vampires that he has captured for this purpose, and when she wakes up at sunset, she immediately begins to scream and try to move away from it and towards him. He screams at her, trying to get her to tell him why she's scared of the cross. Obviously, she doesn't respond, and after a little while, he just throws her outside to let the other vampires have at her. After this round of experiments, he kind of realizes that he might not have the base scientific knowledge to really even understand either the vampires or the infection that is causing the problem. Again, in the movie, there is a scene kind of like this where we see him experimenting on rats and trying to find the cure, and then eventually capturing a female Darkseeker to test his cure on. This begins the biggest miss in the movie, though, which is the completely unaddressed aspect of the story where the Darkseekers are more intelligent than they seem, which is hinted at several times. We see it first suggested when he goes to capture this female Darkseeker initially, and the male Darkseeker sticks his head into the sunlight willingly, burning himself after he sees Will Smith taking her away. Returning to the book, Robert goes to the only place that still exists where you can learn things you don't know: the library.
I'm Michael the librarian, and this place is the library.
He grabs a bunch of books about the human body, a few books about blood, and after a few moments of hesitation, some books about bacteriology as well. When he gets back to his house, he starts reading through the books and comes to a realization. Everything he's read about blood-borne illnesses has associated it with bacterial infections. He's dismissed the idea so far because it just seems ridiculous to him that vampirism could be caused by a bacteria, but now that he does some more research, it seems like it's the only assumption that makes any sense. If you want a more detailed scientific explanation, I've linked the wiki article in the description about the vampire bacteria from the book. There are also, if you just Google it, lots of other resources out there that will do a much better job than I could explaining the scientific details of how the virus works. So he stops thinking about kind of how he could prove that it's bacterial and starts thinking about how he could disprove that it's bacterial, but really what it comes down to is it just lines up too closely with too many of the ways that bacterial infections work, and he can't really find a way to disprove that it is a bacterial infection. It explains how it spreads so fast through flies and mosquitoes that cause the dust storms. It explains why they avoid the sun, because the radiation would kill the bacteria. It also explains how the sickness is almost puppeting these people's bodies to keep itself alive, hence the need to drink blood so that the bacteria can replicate. Well, what about crosses then? But he starts to wonder if that might actually just be a leftover psychological effect. He realizes that he can test that theory. He just needs to find someone who is a vampire who he knows comes from a non-Christian faith, that he can see how they react to a cross put in front of them. Notable here that vampires are the most common in Europe, where Christian religions are the dominant faith. So if vampires were scared of holy symbols due to some psychological reason, it would make sense that crosses were the most historically abundant one that they were scared of. But the first step is to confirm his bacteria theory, for which he needs a microscope. He manages to find a decent one and practices with it for a few days until he feels like he's got the hang of it. Then he gets a sample of blood from one of the women, and lo and behold, there it is, the bacteria causing all of his problems. I know that there's a little bit of suspension of disbelief, or sometimes a lot, in fiction stories, just inherently because they're not true. So I try not to be too critical when a story does something that doesn't make, complete logical sense. But honestly, this is probably one of my few criticisms of the actual story of the book, which is that if you can see it in a regular microscope, that it is bacterial, why was there ever any question or anyone who disputed that bacteria was the cause of this problem? That Seems like something scientists should have figured out very quickly. I do get the impression that the world devolved pretty quickly due to all the flashbacks that we kind of get throughout the story, but still it feels like he shouldn't be the one discovering this if it was this easy to figure out. Anyways, he continues experimenting now with the knowledge that it's a bacteria that's causing it, and he even tries injecting that essence of garlic just directly into some of the blood to see if anything happens, but nothing does. He does manage to kill the bacteria with a sun lamp, but this still doesn't explain the garlic, the crosses, or the mirrors that they are scared of as well. Also, having been alone for so long, we really see that Robert is not very stable emotionally at this point, and the frustration of not being able to explain the crosses or the mirrors or the garlic leads him back to drinking. After a 2-day bender, he goes outside to get some fresh air, and to his surprise, there's a dog wandering around his yard. A healthy, non-infected dog. I swear we'll talk about the dog, but first I just want to talk about the insane amount that they changed the premise of the story when they made the movie. Look, I don't blame them for leaving all the hard science out of the movie. I'm even skipping over most of it because it's just really cumbersome to explain. But in the movie, the virus is accidentally created by humans while trying to cause cancer.
Well, the premise is quite simple. Take something designed by nature and reprogram it to make it work for the body rather than against it.
You're talking about a virus?
Indeed, yes, in this case, the measles virus, which has been engineered at a genetic level to be helpful rather than harmful.
What kind of bizarre anti-vax messaging is behind this movie? Why even add that to the movie? To make, like, the humans more culpable for this? What is the point of that? Beyond that, we've already talked a ton about how they made him a completely different character. Even if they had just made him a scientist instead of like a blue-collar worker, I could forgive that, because there's a lot of explaining regarding how Robert even learns the skills and knowledge as much as he does to learn as much as he does about the virus. But they just made him a completely different guy from a completely different place with a completely different background, and pretty much the only thing that the two characters share is their name. Lastly, I just have to reiterate this. Why change it from vampires? They're literally called Darkseekers, which just feels like the non-copyright infringement generic version of the name vampire. Why not just stick to the original source materials, at least in this one way, to make it easier to more faithfully adapt the original story? Anyways, on to the star of the show. This cute little guy is a central part to the movie, and the fact is that he just isn't really around for nearly as long in the book, but you're probably wondering where he is, so I'll tell you. Unfortunately, I do have to warn you, I think what happens in the book is even sadder than what happens in the movie. As soon as Neville sees the dog on the lawn and it sees him, it bolts. Now, you have to keep in context, this man has not had any companionship, human, animal, or otherwise, in 9 months. So this dog being alive and unturned really feels like a legitimate miracle to him. He wants nothing more than to win this dog over. So, feeling his first spark of hope in a long time, he starts leaving out a hamburger patty and some milk for the dog multiple times a day to convince it that he means well and that his home is a safe place. We're not told exactly how long this goes on for, but we know it's weeks. Slowly over time, the dog runs away a little bit less after eating, and eventually Neville can even be out there while he's eating, and after enough time, the dog will even let Neville sit close enough to touch him. Neville is getting to the point now where he feels like he's getting pretty close to being able to pet it and possibly even get it to come inside and stay with him. But one day the dog doesn't show up, and for 2 more days it's nowhere to be found. Neville is frantic at this point. The dog is really the only thing that has kept him hopeful over what at this point must be at least a month, and it's the only really happy thing we've seen happen to him throughout the entire story so far. Eventually, as the dog comes back, he's elated until he sees the listless look in the dog's eyes and the dark color of its tongue. The dog has also fallen prey to the infection. Over the next few days, Neville watches the dog come and go, getting weaker and weaker as the sickness overtakes it, until finally he can't stand watching the dog go through this anymore and takes the dog inside to try to help it. He brings the dog inside and feeds it and holds it and rubs its head until eventually the dog does trust him, happily curling up in his lap and licking his hand. But a week later, the dog has succumbed to its sickness and passed away. This is not a super happy, cheery book. The movie has its moments of sadness, don't get me wrong, but ultimately at the end it is like a story of hope and the perseverance of the human race. The book is about hope too, kind of, but we spend a lot more time watching Robert suffer before we get to anything hopeful. It almost feels to Robert and to us, the reader, like the universe is just leading him on to give him a little bit of hope and happiness, only to take it away, and this is not the last time that's going to happen. We jump forward over 2 years. It's now June of 1978, and our story started in January of 1976, which was already about a year after the plague started to take over the world. Robert is to the point now where he's kind of just passing time. He's kind of gotten things back on track. His world has settled after the passing of the dog. So he's out doing his favorite hobby, which is searching for Ben Cortman, a man who he knew before the plague, but who comes to his house every night with the rest of the vampires now that Ben is also a vampire. So he stops on the porch of one of the empty houses to take a puff off his pipe, and his eyes wander out into a field nearby where he sees the last thing that he expects. A woman. Before we even get into this part, I just want you to know if you're thinking, oh, so this is where we finally get back on track with the movie. Unfortunately, it's kind of the opposite. The woman is a completely different character than the one in the adaptation. Firstly, she doesn't have a child. Secondly, he's pretty weird to her, even in comparison to the movie. Thirdly, they have a much more antagonistic relationship. And fourthly, she's just not a very believable woman. This is definitely like a men writing women type of situation, in my opinion. But after a moment of stunned silence and an odd admiration for her age, which is younger than him, and appearance, he yells across the field to her. "Hi!" he cried. He jumped down to the sidewalk. "Hi there!" A moment of sudden, complete silence. Her head jerked up and they looked at each other. Alive, he thought. Alive! With a sudden twisting motion, the young woman turned and began running wildly back across the field. Now, it's pretty easy to put yourself in this woman's shoes. Random man screams way too excitedly at her. We're in a post-apocalyptic society. It's a fair assumption on her part that he might not have her best interests in mind. Not that Robert is actually up to anything nefarious, although he has had some troubling thoughts and urges towards women throughout the story. He doesn't help the situation when he begins to chase after her, which he eventually catches her putting his hand on her shoulder, which she jerks away from, causing her to fall. Unfortunately, I think that the connection that we're supposed to make here is that he tried to help the dog, but by the time he won its trust over, it was infected. So this time when he has a chance at companionship, he's unwilling to let her get away and sort of go slowly. Although obviously comparing the woman to a dog doesn't have the greatest implications for Robert's state of mind or like thoughts about women. Eventually he does get her to tell him her name and gets her to come back to his house, although we do learn that he basically had to drag her there and she was screaming at him not to kill her. Here he literally compares her to a dog in his mind, saying that she cowered in a corner the same way that the dog did when he first brought it inside. Are you getting yet that the relationship between this woman and Neville is not the same in the book as it is in the movie?
Where have you been?
I was on a Red Cross evacuation ship out of Sao Paulo.
Those bolts weren't meant to be permanent.
It is much weirder and more problematic, but to his small credit, he does acknowledge internally that he is treating her poorly. He also acknowledges that his treatment of her stems from a distrust from being alone for so long and from having seen so many vampires in their daytime coma that look like healthy people only for them to turn into bloodthirsty monsters at night. So, trying to disabuse himself of his concerns about trusting her, he starts to question her. "Where are you from?" She lay there looking blankly at him. "I asked you where you are from," he said. Again, she said nothing. He pushed himself away from the wall with a tight look on his face. Inglewood, she said hastily. He looked at her coldly for a moment, then leaned back against the wall. I see, he said. Did you live alone? I was married. Where is your husband? Her throat moved. He's dead. For how long? Last week. And what did you do after he died? Ran. She bit into her lower lip. I ran away. You mean you've been wandering all this time? Yes. He leaves abruptly and comes back with a plate of mashed garlic and sticks it in her face, knowing that vampires don't like garlic. Speaking of which, we learn that he eventually figured out that the reaction that vampires have to garlic has to do with the smell of it, which is why him injecting that essence of garlic into the vampire and into the blood did nothing. The woman begs him to get the garlic away and eventually has to run to the bathroom to be sick. His immediate response is to assume that she is, in fact, infected. But upon further thought, he realizes that this experiment with the garlic didn't really prove anything conclusively. She has been wandering for about a week and is obviously weakened by it and probably hasn't eaten very much, so it would be understandable if on an empty stomach the strong smell of garlic being shoved in her face made her feel sick. Her response seems to confirm this. I've had a weak stomach all my life, she said. I saw my husband killed last week, torn to pieces. Right in front of my eyes, I saw it. I lost 2 children to the plague, and for the past week I've been wandering all over, hiding at night, not eating more than a few scraps of food, sick with fear, unable to sleep more than a couple of hours at a time. Then I hear someone shout at me. You chase me over a field, hit me, drag me to your house, then when I get sick because you shove a plate of reeking garlic in my face, you tell me I'm infected. Her hands twitched in her lap. What do you expect to happen? She said angrily. Eventually, he basically forces her to drink a glass of whiskey to get her to calm down after she threatens to leave through the front door, even though it's nighttime. Afterwards, she takes a bath and they eat dinner, and she tells him that she'll let him check her blood to see if she is infected, but she asked if they could please do it in the morning because she's really exhausted and she's had a very long day, which feels very reasonable to me. They sit down and have some wine together and talk, and this is really the closest we've seen them to getting along. He's definitely ogling her and admiring how attractive he finds her, but also says that he doesn't feel any physical desire for her. But right after this, he also says that maybe if she had come 2 years earlier, he would have sexually assaulted her, which is why would you think that? Again, arguably Robert Neville is a bad person, and also maybe arguably he is just a broken man in a very bad situation who's been very desocialized from being alone so much. Either way, again, he's not the upstanding guy that we see Will Smith portraying in the movie. But I also think this might have been why they gave a woman the child in the movie, so that we as the audience would not view her as much as a potential love interest, but more as a desperate mother just trying to take care of her child. Which is a much less problematic story and probably much more suited for Hollywood, but does also kind of erase what is a very big part of Robert's character, which is his lack of socialization and desperation for companionship by the time he meets her, as well as his questionable morals. They continue to chat about how her and her husband lived and how Robert knows so much about how the virus works. She's pretty impressed by how nice his house is, how he has power, how he has so much food, and how prepared he is. She says that they are living much nicer than her and her husband were. Ruth, that's her name, excuses herself to go to the bathroom, and while she's gone, all he can think about is what comes next. Will she be infected? If she is, he's gonna have to cure her. If not, he's almost more nervous. Then what? Would she stay? Would they start to foster a relationship? Maybe eventually have children? This is a crazy line of thought under normal circumstances, but honestly, this is one of the first thoughts that he has had about her that I actually feel like I understand. He's legitimately concerned that they might be the last 2 non-vampires alive, and she's also the best shot that he's had at not being dreadfully alone since his wife and daughter passed away over 2 years ago. When she gets back, he kind of plays it cool and explains that he knows that the cross thing isn't like a physical response and that it's a psychological response because one of the vampires he captured, the cross didn't work on, but the Torah did, suggesting that it is not anything to actually do with the cross. It's more related to their psychological state. She asks him to tell her about himself, and he's genuinely a little bit torn. "Tell me about yourself," she said. Another typical feminine question, he thought. Then he berated himself for being so critical. What was the point in irritating himself by doubting her? "Nothing to tell," he said. She was smiling again. Was she laughing at him? "You scared the life out of me this afternoon," she said. "You and your bristly beard and those wild eyes." He blew out smoke. Wild eyes? That was ridiculous. What was she trying to do? Break down his reserve with cuteness? "What do you look like under all those whiskers?" she asked. He tried to smile at her, but he couldn't. "Nothing," he said, "just an ordinary face." "How old are you, Robert?" His throat moved. It was the first time she had spoken his name. It gave him a strange, restless feeling to hear a woman speak his name after so long. "Don't call me that," he almost said to her. He didn't want to lose the distance between them. If she were infected and he couldn't cure her, he wanted it to be a stranger that he put away. The story is old, so we'll forgive a little bit of the cliche of like her asking what he looks like under all those whiskers, which is a little bit cringeworthy. But I think the pull he feels towards knowing her more to have that companionship and possibly build a relationship, and not knowing her more so that if he has to hurt her and kill her, he feels not as bad about it. That conflict of emotions feels really genuine to me. Their conversation continues as she asks him a bunch of scientific questions about how the virus works, which again, I'm going to skip over because it's pretty dry. But the conversation ends somewhat abruptly when it veers towards why Robert has been killing so many of the vampires and how he's sure that they would die anyways even if he didn't kill them. Just as a little note here, we do see him doing this throughout the story whenever he goes and like explores the houses. If he finds vampires there, he will kill them. That's why he was making so many stakes with the lathe at the beginning of the video, was to kill the vampires. Ruth doesn't seem too convinced that they would die if he didn't kill them, but won't really give any more reason to why she thinks that. In the middle of the night, he wakes up on the couch screaming "Verge," which was his nickname for his late wife, Virginia, and he sees a dark figure cringing against the wall next to the front door. In his half-asleep daze, it takes Robert a few seconds to realize that that dark figure is Ruth. He questions her about why she's awake and why she's dressed and near the front door since it's the middle of the night. She just tells him that she couldn't sleep, and he doesn't really push the issue. She asks him who he thought she was, and he admits that he thought she was his wife, who, after he had buried her illegally instead of burning her, had come back into the house and appeared as a dark figure inside of the house in a similar way that she did, and tried to drink his blood, and how he was forced to kill her. He starts to get emotional, and she holds him as he holds her, and he apologizes for not trusting her. "I'm sorry, Ruth." "Sorry?" "For being so cruel to you, for not trusting you." She was silent, holding tight. "Oh, Robert," she said then, "it's so unfair, so unfair. Why are we still alive? Why aren't we all dead? It would be better if we were all dead." He then goes on to tell her that they should check if she's infected, but he promises her that if she is infected, they'll cure her, and he swears that he will figure out how. She's reluctant but goes with him, and she lets him draw her blood, but as he is looking at it under the microscope, she slams him on the head with a wooden mallet from his workshop. As he blacks out, his hand runs down her calf, and he can see that some of the tan rubs away. When he wakes up, he remembers what happened, and he sees a note on the bench next to his now broken microscope. It says the following: "Robert, now you know that I was spying on you. Know that almost everything I told you was a lie. I'm writing this note, though, because I want to save you if I can. When I was first given the job of spying on you, I had no feelings about your life, because I did have a husband, Robert. You killed him. But now it's different. I know that you were just as much forced into your situation as we were forced into ours. We are infected, but you already know that. What you don't understand yet is that we're going to stay alive. We found a way to do that, and we're going to set up society again, slowly but surely. We're going to do away with all these wretched creatures whom death has cheated, and even though I pray otherwise, we may decide to kill you and those like you. I'll try to save you. I'll tell them you're too well armed for us to attack now. Use the time I'm giving you, Robert. Get away from your house. Go into the mountains and save yourself. There are only a handful of us now, but sooner or later we'll be too well organized, and nothing I say will stop the rest from destroying you. For God's sake, Robert, go now while you can. I know you may not believe this. You may not believe that we can live in the sun for short periods now. You may not believe that my tan was only makeup. You may not believe that we can live with the germ now. That's why I'm leaving one of my pills. I took them all the time when I was here. I kept them in a belt around my waist. You'll discover that they're a combination of defibrinated blood and a drug. I don't know myself just what it is. The blood feeds the germs, the drug prevents its multiplication. It was the discovery of this pill that saved us from dying that is helping us set up society again slowly. Believe me, it's true, and escape. Forgive me too. I didn't mean to hit you. It nearly killed me to do it. But I was so terribly frightened of what you'd do when you found out. Forgive me for having to lie to you about so many things, but please believe this. When we were together in the darkness, close to each other, I wasn't spying on you. I was loving you. The pills don't make sense to him, and what he realizes is that even though he has read it a million different times now in a bunch of different books, it had never really sunk in. The bacteria can mutate. Flash forward to January of the next year, 1979, and a group of men in dark cars show up to his house with spotlights on their guns and axes. Neville watches as they quickly kill the vampires that are waiting outside his house, ending them with the efficiency of trained military men. Soon the men are breaking down his door and blasting the lock with their guns. Robert is ready to surrender, but they don't ask for a surrender. When he realizes they aren't going to ask him to stand down, he believes that they are there to kill him. He rushes upstairs to grab his gun, and as he's heading back downstairs, two of the men spot him. Without even thinking, he just starts unloading rounds on them and hears one of them scream in pain. But soon the men have him beaten into a blackout and they carry his body out of his home. He wakes up in a room with bars on the windows and he hears the door open behind him a short time later. Ruth enters his view and asks him if he is thirsty, getting him a glass of water and bending down to wipe the sweat off his face. She asks him why he didn't believe her and he tells her that he did, and so she asks him why he didn't get away. "I couldn't," he muttered. "I almost went several times. Once I even packed and started out, but I couldn't go. I was too used to the house. It was a habit, just like the habit of living. I got used to it." When he asks her how such a fine society could have such ruthless killers as the men that they sent to get him, she responds by saying, "Maybe you did see joy on their faces," she said. "It's not surprising. They're young, and they are killers, assigned killers, legal killers. They're respected for their killing, admired for it. What can you expect of them? They're only fallible men, and men can learn to enjoy killing. That's an old story, Neville. You know that." She asks him if he knows that they're going to have to execute him, and he says he does, but she asks him if he's scared, and he says he isn't. "Robert," she said, "listen to me. They mean to execute you. Even though you're wounded, they have to. The people have been out there all night waiting. They're terrified of you, Robert. They hate you, and they want your life." She gives him some pills that will end his life more quietly, but before he takes them, he gets up to look out his barred window at the people crowded around waiting. The street was filled with people. They milled and stirred in the gray light of morning, the sound of their talking like the buzzing of a million insects. He looked out over the people, his left hand gripping the bars with bloodless fingers, his eyes fever-lit. Then someone saw him. For a moment, there was an increased babbling of voices, a few startled cries. Then sudden silence, as though a heavy blanket had fallen over their heads. They all stood looking up at him with their white faces. He stared back, and suddenly he thought, "I'm the abnormal one now." Normalcy was a majority concept, the standard of the many, and not the standard of just one man. Abruptly, that realization joined with what he saw on their faces: awe, fear, shrinking horror. And he knew that they were afraid of him. To them, he was some terrible scourge they had never seen, a scourge even worse than the disease they had come to live with. He was an invisible specter who had left for evidence of his existence the bloodless bodies of their loved ones, and he understood what they felt and did not hate them. His right hand tightened on that tiny envelope of pills. So long as the end did not come with violence, so long as it did not have to be a butchery before their eyes. With that thought, he takes the pills and realizes that everything has come full circle. His kind will be the new superstition to these people, like the vampires were to his. To be honest, I can see why someone would want to adapt this story after reading it. There are some great themes in it about what makes us human, and I think the story really holds up a lot better than other stories that were written during that time, especially like kind of pulpy sci-fi stuff. There is a question early in the story where Robert is asking himself if we're even really better than the vampires, and it's a fair question. Honestly, with a little bit of modernization, some of the misogynistic stuff removed, and an actor with some star power, this could be a really good adaptation. It's probably what someone thought at some point before they actually adapted the story, changed it completely, and removed everything about it that makes it special. If you watched my Shining video, this will sound like a familiar situation, and obviously it does remind me of it a lot. I Am Legend is not a great movie. It's not a horrible movie. It's just kind of mid, but it's only that way because you can tell this movie was made by committee and changed so much to fit into the typical mold of a Hollywood blockbuster. Even though I don't agree with Kubrick's decisions on The Shining, at least it felt purposeful and artistic instead of diluted. If you've seen this movie, you're probably confused about where they got the ending for the movie, since it has absolutely nothing to do with the book, but as we've seen before, like with The Shining, they've changed so much of the story up to the ending that they had to change the ending as well because it just wouldn't have made sense. There was too much about the story that was too different for the ending to stay the same, but it's actually worse than that. If you aren't familiar with the original ending, don't know how you made it this far in the video, but thank you for watching. Basically, Robert saves the woman and her son's life by sacrificing himself and sends them off with the cure to the disease to some colony where there are a bunch of survivors. But in the ending that was originally shot for the movie, Robert gives the female Darkseeker back to the male Darkseeker because the only reason that they were even attacking him in the first place is because they just wanted her back. Just for a little bit of extra clarification, if you haven't seen the movie, that's completely different than what happens in the original ending of the movie, and the original end of the movie really frames the Darkseekers as the bad guys and like monsters and inhuman, which is really incongruous with what happens in the actual movie, where they kind of portray the Darkseekers as being smarter than they seem, like the very obvious implication when he first takes the female Darkseeker away from her colony that the male Darkseeker is angry about it, and also the time in the movie where they trap him by like baiting him, which shows some kind of like level of sentience and intelligence that we didn't think they had. In the original ending, all of that stuff just goes completely unaddressed and gets thrown out the window. At least in the alternate ending, they kind of follow through with the themes and plot that they've set up throughout the movie. I'll link the full alternate ending in the description if you want to watch it. I would have had a much easier time forgiving the other changes that they made in the movie if they at least stuck with this alternate ending, which was the one that they actually had originally planned for the movie to have, but apparently it tested poorly when they showed it to test audiences, so they decided to go back and change it. Here's what the director, Francis Lawrence, had to say about that in an interview with Screen Rant. Looking back at it now, I think that we could have just done basically the story of the novella straight up and made the same amount of money in terms of ticket sales because people went, I think, for The Last Man on Earth. They would have accepted the nihilistic ending. They would have accepted vampires instead of people with infections. We could have literally made the book. And he also said this in reference to the ending where they just give the Darkseeker his wife back. I agree it's the better ending. I mean, it's the more philosophical version of the end. But in terms of story math, we're doing everything we're not supposed to, right? The hero doesn't find the cure, right? They drive off into the unknown, and the creatures you've been saying are the bad ones the whole time you learn actually have humanity and aren't the bad ones. The hero's the bad one. And so you've basically turned everything on its head. We tested it twice, and it got wildly rejected, which is why we came out with the other one. The moral of the story here is, if you've ever wondered why some weird decision was made in an adaptation, how they decided on a dumb ending for a movie, or why The Hobbit ended up being a trilogy of movies even though it's just one book and it's also the shortest book, this is how. Movies made by committee with stories dumbed down because people are too scared to make something artistic, and instead they make something that's mediocre because it's less risky. Anyways, you should read the original story if you can. It's a great book, it's a quick read, and I think I've pretty much said everything I have to say about I Am Legend. If you've watched this far, thank you so much for your time and attention. It's always greatly appreciated, and feel free to leave a comment if you have any criticisms or noticed anything I got wrong. Or if you just want to say, thanks, great video, I would also appreciate that as well. And if you want to see more videos like this, go ahead and subscribe. This whole videos about adaptations thing is kind of what I'm doing right now, so you can expect more like it. And thank you again for watching. I will see you guys in the next one.